Section 33, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 33, Chapter 9, The Defection of Britain. One thing stands out in the fate of modern Europe: the profound cleavage due to the Reformation. One thing made that wound, it was almost mortal, so deep and lasting: the failure of one ancient province of civilization, and one only, to keep the faith. This province whereof I write, Britain. The capital event, the critical moment in the great struggle of the faith against the Reformation, was the defection of Britain. It is a point which the modern historian, who is still normally anti-Catholic, does not and cannot make. Yet the defection of Britain from the faith of Europe 300 years ago is certainly the most important historical event in the last 1,000 years, between the saving of Europe from the barbarians and these our own times. It is perhaps the most important historical event since the triumph of the Catholic Church under Constantine. Let me recapitulate the factors of the problem as they would be seen by an impartial observer from some great distance in time or in space or in mental attitude. Let me put them as they would appear to one quite indifferent to and remote from the antagonists. To such an observer, the history of Europe would be that of the great Roman Empire passing through the transformation I have described. Its mind, first more and more restless, then more and more tending to certain conclusion, and that conclusion, the Catholic Church. To summarize what has gone before, the Catholic Church becomes by the 5th century the soul, the vital principle, the continuity of Europe. It next suffers grievously from the accident, largely geographical, of the Eastern Schism, which is of its nature perpetually subject to assault from within, because it deals with matters not open to positive proof; from without, because all those, whether aliens or guests or parasites, who are not of our civilization, are naturally its enemies. The Roman Empire of the West, in which the purity and the unity of this soul were preserved from generation to generation, declined in its body during the Dark Ages, say up to and rather beyond the year 1000. It became coarsened and less in its material powers. It lost its central organization, the imperial court, which was replaced first by provincial military leaders or kings, then later by a mass of local lordships jumbled into more or less national groups. In building, in writing, in cooking, in clothing, in drawing, in sculpture, the Roman Empire of the West, which is ourselves, forgot all but the fundamentals of its arts, but it expanded so far as its area is concerned. A whole belt of barbaric Germany received the Roman influence, baptism and the Mass. With the Creed there came to these outer parts, reading and writing, building in brick and stone, all the material essentials of our civilization. And what is characteristic of that culture? The power of thinking more clearly. It is centuries before this slow digestion of the barbarian reached longitude 10 degrees east and the Scandinavian peninsula. But 1,000 years after our Lord it has reached even these, and there remains between the unbroken tradition of our civilization in the West and the schismatic but Christian civilization of the Greek Church nothing but a belt of paganism from the corner of the Baltic southward, which belt is lessened year after year by the armed efforts and the rational dominance of Latin culture. Our Christian and Roman culture proceeds continuously eastward, mastering the uncouth. After this general picture of a civilization dominating and mastering in its material decline a vastly greater area than it had known in the height of its material excellence, this sort of expansion in the dark, the impartial observer whom we have supposed would remark a sort of dawn. That dawn came with the 11th century, 1000 to 1100. The Norman race, the sudden invigoration of the papacy, the new victories in Spain, at last the First Crusade, mark a turn in the tide of material decline, and that tide works very rapidly towards a new and intense civilization which we call that of the Middle Ages, that high renewal which gives Europe a second and most marvellous life, which is a late reflowering of Rome, but of Rome revivified with the virtue and the humour of the faith. The second thing that the observer would note in so general a picture would be the peculiar exception formed within it by the group of large islands lying to the north and west of the continent. Of these, the larger, Britain, had been a true Roman province. But very early in the process, in the middle and the end of the 5th century, it had, on the first assault of the barbarians, been cut off for more than the lifetime of a man. Its gate had been held by the barbarian. Then it was re-Christianized almost as thoroughly as though even its eastern part had never lost the authority of civilization. The mission of St. Augustine recaptured Britain, but Britain is remarkable in the history of civilization for the fact that alone of civilized lands it needed to be recaptured at all. The western island of the two, the smaller island, Ireland, presented another exception. It was not compelled to the Christian culture, as were the German barbarians of the continent, by arms. No Charlemagne with his Gallic armies forced it tardily to accept baptism. It was not savage like the Germanies. It was therefore under no necessity to go to school. It was not a morass of shifting tribes. It was a nation, but in a most exceptional fashion. Though already possessed, and perhaps because so possessed, of a high pagan culture of its own, it accepted within the lifetime of a man, and by spiritual influences alone, the whole spirit of the creed. The civilization of the Roman West was accepted by Ireland, not as a command or as an influence, but as a discovery. Now let this peculiar fate of the two islands to the north and west of the continent remain in the observer's mind, and he will note, when the shock of what is called the Reformation comes, new phenomena attaching to those islands, cognate to their early history. Those phenomena are the thesis which I have to present in the pages that follow. What we call the Reformation was essentially the reaction of the barbaric, the ill-tutored, and the isolated places external to the old and deep-rooted Roman civilization against the influences of that civilization. The Reformation was not racial, even if there were such a physical thing as a Teutonic race, and there is nothing of the kind. The Reformation shows no coincidence with that race. The Reformation is simply the turning back of that tide of Roman culture which for 500 years had steadily set forward and had progressively dominated the insufficient by the sufficient, the slower by the quicker, the confused by the clear-headed. It was a sort of protest by the conquered against a moral and intellectual superiority which offended them. The Slavs of Bohemia joined in that sincere protest of the lately and insufficiently civilized quite as strongly as, and even earlier than, the vague peoples of the sandy heaths along the Baltic. The Scandinavian, physically quite different from these tribes of the Baltic plain, comes into the game. Wretched villages in the Mark of Brandenburg, as Slavonic in type as the villages of Bohemia, revolt as naturally against exalted and difficult mystery as do the isolated villages of the Swedish valleys or the isolated rustics of the Cevennes or the Alps. The revolt is confused, instinctive, and therefore enjoying the sincere motive which accompanies such risings, but deprived of unity and of organizing power. There has never been a fixed Protestant creed. The common factor has been and is reaction against the traditions of Europe. Now the point to seize is this. Inimical as such a revolt was to the souls, or to speak upon the mere historical plane, to civilization, bad as it was that the tide of culture should have begun to ebb from the far regions which it had once so beneficently flooded, The Reformation, that is, the reaction against the unity, the discipline, and the clear thought of Europe, would never have counted largely in human affairs had it been confined to the external fringe of the civilized world. That fringe would probably have been reconquered. The inherent force attaching to reality and to the stronger mind should have led to its recovery. The northern Germanies were, as a fact, reconquered when Richelieu stepped in and saved them from their southern superiors. But perhaps it would not have been reconquered. Perhaps it would have lapsed quite soon into its original paganism. At any rate, European culture would have continued undivided and strong without these outer regions. Unfortunately, a far worse thing happened. Europe was rent and has remained divided. The disaster was accomplished through forces I will now describe. The end of section 33. Section 34, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc, Section 34, Chapter 9, continued. Though the revolt was external to the foundations of Europe, to the ancient provinces of the Empire, yet an external consequence of that revolt arose within the ancient provinces. It may be briefly told. The wealthy took advantage, within the heart of civilization itself, of this external revolt against order. For it is always to the advantage of the wealthy to deny general conceptions of right and wrong, to question a popular philosophy, and to weaken the drastic and immediate power of the human will, organized throughout the whole community. It is always in the nature of a great wealth to be insanely tempted, though it should know from active experience how little wealth can give, to push on to more and more domination over the bodies of men, and it can do so best by attacking fixed social restraints. The landed squires, then, and the great merchants, powerfully supported by the Jewish financial communities in the principal towns, felt that within the Reformation their opportunity had come. The largest fortune holders, the nobles, the merchants of the ports and local capitals, even in Gaul, that nucleus and stronghold of ordered human life, licked their lips. Everywhere in northern Italy, in southern Germany upon the Rhine, wherever wealth had congested in a few hands, the chance of breaking with the old morals was the most powerful appeal to the wealthy, and therefore throughout Europe, even in its most ancient seats of civilization, the outer barbarian had allies. These rich men, whose avarice betrayed Europe from within, had no excuse. Theirs was not any dumb, instinctive revolt like that of the outer Germanies, the outer Slavs, nor the neglected mountain valleys, against order and against clear thought, with all the hard consequences that clear thought brings. They were in no way subject to enthusiasm for the vaguer emotions roused by the gospel, or for the more turgid excitements derivable from Scripture and an uncorrected orgy of prophecy. They were on the make. The rich in Montpellier and Nimes, a knot of them in Rome itself, many in Milan, in Lyons, in Paris, enlisted intellectual aid for the revolt, flattered the atheism of the Renaissance, supported the strong, inflamed critics of clerical misliving, and even winked solemnly at the lunatic inspirations of obscure men and women filled with visions. They did all these things as though their objective was religious change, but their true object was money. One group, and one alone of the European nations, was too recently filled with combat against vile non-Christian things to accept any parley with this anti-Christian turmoil. That unit was the Iberian Peninsula. It is worthy of remark, especially on the part of those who realize that the sword fits the hand of the Church, and that Catholicism is never more alive than when it is in arms. I say it is worthy of remark by these that Spain and Portugal, through the very greatness of an experience still recent when the Reformation broke, lost the chance of combat. There came indeed from Spain, but from the Basque nation there, that weapon of steel, the Society of Jesus, which St. Ignatius formed, and which, surgical and military, saved the faith, and therefore Europe. But the Iberian Peninsula, rejecting as one whole, and with contempt and with abhorrency, and rejecting rightly any consideration of revolt, even among its rich men, thereby lost its opportunity for combat. It did not enjoy the religious wars which revivified France, and it may be urged that Spain would be the stronger today had it fallen to her task, as it did to the general populace of Gaul, to come to hand grips with the Reformation at home, to test it, to know it, to dominate it, to bend the muscles upon it, and to re-emerge triumphant from the struggle. I say then that there was present in the field against the Catholic Church a powerful ally for the Reformers, and that ally was the body of immoral rich, who hoped to profit by a general break in the popular organization of society. The atheism and the wealth, the luxury and the sensuality, the scholarship and aloofness of the Renaissance answered, over the heads of the Catholic populace, the call of barbarism. The iconoclasts of greed joined hands with the iconoclasts of blindness and rage, and with the iconoclasts of academic pride. Nevertheless, even with such allies, barbarianism would have failed. The Reformation would today be but an historical episode without fruit. Europe would still be Christendom, had not there been added the decisive factor of all, which was the separation of Britain. Now, how did Britain go, and why was the loss of Britain of such capital importance? The loss of Britain was of such capital importance because Britain alone of those who departed was Roman, and therefore capable of endurance and increase. And why did Britain fail that great ordeal? It is a question harder to answer. The province of Britain was not a very great one in area or in numbers when the Reformation broke out. It was indeed very wealthy for its size, as were the Netherlands, but its mere wealth does not account for the fundamental importance of the loss of Britain to the faith in the 16th century. The real point was that one and only one of the old Roman provinces, with their tradition of civilization, letters, persuasive power, multiple soul, and one and only one, went over to the barbaric enemy and gave that enemy its aid. That one was Britain, and the consequences of its defection was the perpetuation and extension of an increasingly evil division within the structure of the West. To say that Britain lost hold of tradition in the 16th century because Britain is Teutonic is to talk nonsense. It is to explain a real problem by inventing unreal words. Britain is not Teutonic, nor does the word Teutonic itself mean anything definite. To say that Britain revolted because the seeds of revolt were stronger in her than in any ancient province of Europe is to know nothing of history. The seeds of revolt were in her then, as they were in every other community, as they must be in every individual who may find any form of discipline a burden which he is tempted in a moment of disorder to lay down. But to pretend that England and the lowlands of Scotland, to pretend that the province of Britain in our general civilization was more ready for the change than the infected portions of southern Gaul or the humming towns of northern Italy or the intense life of Hainault or Brabant, is to show great ignorance of the European past. Well then, how did Britain break away? I beg the reader to pay especial attention to the next page or so. I believe it to be of capital value in explaining the general history of Europe, and I know it to be hardly ever told, if told at all, told only in fragments. England went because of three things. First, her squires had already become too powerful. In other words, the economic power of a small class of wealthy men had grown on account of peculiar insular conditions, greater than was healthy for the community. Secondly, England was, more than any other part of Western Europe, save the Batavian March, footnote, I mean Belgium, that frontier of Roman influence upon the lower Rhine, which so happily held out for the faith and just preserved it, a series of markets and of ports, a place of very active cosmopolitan influence in which new opportunities for the corrupt, new messages of the enthusiastic, were frequent. In the third place, that curious phenomena on which I dwelt in the last chapter, the superstitious attachment of citizens to the civil power, to awe of and devotion to the monarch, was exaggerated in England as nowhere else. Now put these three things together, especially the first and third, for the second was both of minor importance and more superficial, and you will appreciate why England fell. One small, too wealthy class, tainted with the atheism that always creeps into wealth long and securely enjoyed, was beginning to possess too much of English land. It would take far too long to describe here what the process had been. It is true that the absolute monopoly of the soil, the gripping and the strangling of the populace by landlords, is a purely Protestant development. Nothing of that kind had happened or would have been conceived of as possible in pre-Reformation England. But still something like a quarter of the land, or a little less, had already, before the Reformation, got into the full possession of one small class, which had also begun to encroach upon the judiciary in some measure to supplant the populace in local lawmaking, and quite appreciably to supplant the king in central lawmaking. The end of section 34. Section 35, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 35, Chapter 9, continued. Let me not be misunderstood. The England of the 15th century, the England of the generation just before the Reformation, was not an England of squires. It was not an England of landlords. It was still an England of Englishmen. The towns were quite free. To this day, old boroughs nearly always show a great number of freeholds. The process by which the later English aristocracy, now a plutocracy, had grown up was but in germ before the Reformation. Nor had that germ sprouted. But for the Reformation it would not have matured. Sooner or later a popular revolt, had the faith revived, would have killed the growing usurpation of the wealthy. But the germ was there, and the Reformation coming just as it did, both was helped by the rich and helped them. The slow acquisition of considerable power over the courts of law and over the soil of the country by an oligarchy, imperfect though that acquisition was as yet, already presented just after 1500 a predisposing condition to the disease. It may be urged that if the English people had fought the growing power of the squires more vigorously, the squires would not have mastered them as they did during and on account of the religious revolution. Possibly, and the enemies of the English people are quick to suggest that some native sluggishness permitted the gradual weighing down of the social balance in favor of the rich. But no one who can even pretend to know medieval England will say that the English consciously desired or willingly permitted such a state of affairs to grow up. Successful foreign wars, dynastic trouble, a recent and vigorous awakening of national consciousness, which consciousness had centered in the wealthier classes, all these combined to let the evil in without warning. And on the eve of the Reformation, a rich, avaricious class was already empowered to act in Britain, ready to grasp, as all the avaricious classes were throughout the Western world, at the opportunity to revolt against the faith which has ever suspected, constrained, and reformed the tyranny of wealth. Now add to this strange, but at that time very real, worship of government as a fetish. This spirit did not really strengthen the government. Far from it. A superstition never strengthens its object, nor even makes of the supposed power of that object a reality. But though it did not give real power to the long intention of the prince, it gave to the momentary word of the prince a fantastic power. In such a combination of circumstances, nascent oligarchy, but the prince worshipped, you get, holding the position of prince, Henry VIII, a thorough tutor. That is, a man weak almost to the point of irresponsibility where his passions were concerned. Violent from that fundamental weakness which, in the absence of opposition, ruins things as effectively as any strength. No executive power in Europe was less in sympathy with the revolt against civilization than was the Tudor family. Upon the contrary, Henry VII, his son, and his two granddaughters, if anything, exceeded in their passion for the old order of the Western world. But at the least sign of resistance, Mary, who burnt Elizabeth, who intrigued Henry, their father, who pillaged Henry, their grandfather, who robbed and saved, were one. To these characters, slight resistance was a spur; with strong, manifold opposition, they were quite powerless to deal. Their minds did not grip, or their minds, though acute, were not large, but their passions shot, and one may compare them, when their passions of pride, of lust, of jealousy, of doting, of avarice, or of facile power were aroused, to vehement children. Never was there a ruling family less statesmanlike, never one less full of stuff and of creative power. Henry, urged by an imperious young woman who had gained control of him, desired a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, grown old for him. The papal court temporized with him and opposed him. He was incapable of negotiation, and still more incapable of foresight. His energy, which was of an Arabian sort, blasted through the void, because a void was there. None would then withstand the prince. Of course, it seemed to him no more than one of these recurrent quarrels with the mundane power of Rome, which all kings, and saints among them, had engaged in for many hundred years. All real powers thus conflict in all times. But had he known it, and he did not know it, the moment was fatally inopportune for playing that game. Henry never meant to break permanently with the unity of Christendom. A disruption of that unity was probably inconceivable to him. He meant to exercise pressure. All his acts from the decisive proclamation of September 19th, 1530 onwards prove it. But the moment was the moment of a breaking point throughout Europe, and he, Henry, blundered into disaster without knowing what the fullness of the moment was. He was devout, especially to the Blessed Sacrament. He kept the faith for himself, and he tried hard to keep it for others. But having lost unity, he let in what he loathed. Not so long as he lived could those doctrines of the Reformers triumph here. But he had compromised with their spirit, and at his death a strong minority, perhaps a tenth of England, more of London, was already hostile to the creed. It was the same thing with the suppression of the monasteries. Henry meant no effect on religion by that loot. He none the less destroyed it. He intended to enrich the crown. He ruined it. In the matter of their financial endowment, an economic crisis produced by the unequal growth of economic powers had made the monastic foundation ripe for resettlement. Religious orders were here wealthy without reason, poor in spirit and numbers, but rich in land; there impoverished without reason, rich in popularity and spiritual power, but poor in land. The dislocation which all institutions necessarily suffer on the economic side through the mere efflux of time inclined every government in Europe to a resettlement of religious endowment. Everywhere it took place, everywhere it involved dissolution and restoration. But Henry did not resettle. He plundered and broke. He used the contemporary idolatry of executive power just as much at Reading or in the Blackfriars of London, where unthinking and immediate popular feeling was with him, as at Glastonbury, where it was against him, as in Yorkshire, where it was in arms, as in Galway, where there was no bearing with it at all. There was no largeness in him, nor any comprehension of complexity. And when, in this Jacobin, unexampled way, he had simply got rid of that which he should have restored and transformed, of what effect was that vast act of spoliation? It paralyzed the Church. It ultimately brought down the monarchy. From a fourth to a third of the economic power over the means of production in England, which had been vested top-heavily in the religious foundations, here far too rich, there far too poor, Henry got by one enormous confiscation. Yet he made no permanent addition to the wealth of the crown. On the contrary, he started its decline. The land passed by an instinctive multiple process, but very rapidly, to the already powerful class which had begun to dominate the villages. Then, when it was too late, the Tudors attempted to stem the tide, but the thing was done. Upon the indifference which is always common to a society long and profoundly Catholic and ignorant of heresy, or, having conquered heresy, ignorant at any rate of struggle for the faith, two ardent minorities converged. The small minority of confused enthusiasts who really did desire what they believed to be a restoration of primitive Christianity. The much larger minority of men now grown almost invincibly powerful in the economic sphere. The squires, 20 years after Henry's death, had come to possess, through the ruin of religion, something like half the land of England. With the rapidity of a fungus growth, the new wealth spread over the desolation of the land. The enriched captured both the universities, all the courts of justice, most of the public schools. They won their great civil war against the crown. Within a century after Henry's folly, they had established themselves in the place of what had once been the monarchy and central government of England. The impoverished crown resisted in vain. They killed one embarrassed king, Charles I, and they set up his son, Charles II, as an insufficiently salaried puppet. Since their victory over the crown, they and the capitalists who have sprung from their avarice and their philosophy, and largely from their very loins, have been completely masters of England. The end of section 35. Section 36, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 36, Chapter 9, concluded. Here the reader may say, what? This large national movement to be interpreted as the work of such minorities? A few thousand squires and merchants begging a few more thousand enthusiasts changed utterly the mass of England? Yes. To interpret it otherwise is to read history backwards. It is to think that England then was what England later became. There is no more fatal fault in the reading of history, nor any illusion to which the human mind is more prone. To read the remote past in the light of the recent past, to think the process of one towards the other inevitable, to regard the whole matter as a slow, inexorable process independent of the human will, still suits the materialist pantheism of our time. There is an inherent tendency in all men to this fallacy of reading themselves into the past, and of thinking their own mood a consummation at once excellent and necessary, and most men who write of these things imagine a vaguely Protestant Tudor England growing consciously Protestant in the England of the Stuarts. That is not history. It is history to put yourself by a combined effort of reading and of imagination into the shoes of Tuesday, as though you did not know what Wednesday was to be, and then to describe what Tuesday was. England did not lose the faith in 1550 to 1620 because she was Protestant then. Rather, she is Protestant now because she then lost the faith. Put yourself into the shoes of a 16th century Englishman in the midst of the Reformation, and what do you perceive? A society wholly Catholic in tradition, lax and careless in Catholic practice, irritated or enlivened here and there by a few furious preachers or by a few enthusiastic scholars, at once devoted to and in terror of the civil government, intensely national, in all the roots and traditions of its civilization, Roman, impatient of the disproportion of society, and in particular of economic disproportion in the religious aspect of society, because the religious function, by the very definition of Catholicism, by its very creed, should be the first to redress tyrannies. Upon that Englishman comes first a mania for his king, next a violent economic revolution, which in many parts can be made to seem an approach to justice, finally a national appeal of the strongest kind against the encroaching power of Spain. When the work was done by, say, 1620, the communication between England and those parts of the ancient West which were still furiously resisting the storm was cut. No spiritual force could move England after the Armada and its effect, save what might arise spontaneously in the many excited men who still believed, they continued to believe it for 50 years, that the whole Church of Christ had gone wrong for centuries, that its original could be restored, and that personal revelations were granted them for their guidance. These visionaries were the Reformers. To these, souls still athirst for spiritual guidance turned. They were a minority even at the end of the 16th century, the last years of Elizabeth, but they were a minority full of initiative and of action. With the turn of the century, 1600 to 1620, the last men who could remember Catholic training were very old or dead. The new generation could turn to nothing but the new spirit. For authority, it could find nothing definite but a printed book, a translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. For teachers, nothing but this minority, the Reformers. That minority, though remaining a minority, leavened and at last controlled the whole nation. By the first third of the 17th century, Britain was utterly cut off from the unity of Christendom, and its new character was sealed. The Catholic faith was dead. The governing class remained largely indifferent, as it still is, to religion, yet it remained highly cultured. The populace drifted here into complete indifference, there into orgiastic forms of worship. The middle class went over in a solid body to the enemy. The barbarism of the outer Germanies permeated it and transformed it. The closer reasoned, far more perverted and harder French heresy of Calvin partly deflected the current, and a whole new society was formed and launched. That was the English Reformation. Its effect upon Europe was stupendous, for though England was cut off, England was still England. You could not destroy in a Roman province the great traditions of municipality and letters. It was as though a phalanx of trained troops had crossed the frontier in some border war and turned against their former comrades. England lent, and has from that day continuously lent, the strength of a great civilized tradition to forces whose original initiative was directed against European civilization and its tradition. The loss of Britain was the one great wound in the body of the Western world. It is not yet healed. Yet all this, while that other island of the group to the northwest of Europe, that island which had never been conquered by armed civilization, as were the outer Germanies, but had spontaneously accepted the faith, presented a contrasting exception. Against the loss of Britain, which had been a Roman province, the faith, when the smoke of battle cleared off, could discover the astonishing loyalty of Ireland. And over against this exceptional province, Britain, now lost to the faith, lay an equally exceptional and unique outer part, which had never been a Roman province, yet which now remained true to the tradition of Roman men. It balanced the map like a counterweight. The efforts to destroy the faith in Ireland have exceeded in violence, persistence, and cruelty any persecution in any part or time of the world. They have failed. As I cannot explain why they have failed, so I shall not attempt to explain how and why the faith in Ireland was saved when the faith in Britain went under. I do not believe it capable of an historic explanation. It seems to me a phenomenon essentially miraculous in character, not generally attached, as are all historical phenomena, to the general and divine purpose that governs our large political events, but directly and specially attached. It is of great significance how great men will be able to see many years hence, when another definite battle is joined between the forces of the Church and her opponents. For the Irish race alone of all Europe has maintained a perfect integrity and has kept serene without internal reactions and without their consequent disturbances the soul of Europe, which is the Catholic Church. I have now nothing left to set down but the conclusion of this disaster, its spiritual result, an isolation of the soul, its political result, a consequence of the spiritual, the prodigious release of energy, the consequent advance of special knowledge, the domination of the few under a competition left unrestrained, the subjection of the many, the ruin of happiness, the final threat of chaos. The end of section 36, the end of chapter 9. Section 37, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 37, Chapter 10, Conclusion. The grand effect of the Reformation was the isolation of the soul. This was its fruit. From this all its consequences proceed. Not only those clearly noxious, which have put in jeopardy the whole of our traditions and all our happiness, but those apparently advantageous, especially in material things. The process cannot be seen to work if we take a particular date, especially too early a date, and call it the moment of the catastrophe. There was a long interval of confusion and doubt in which it was not certain whether the catastrophe would be final or no, in which its final form remained undetermined, and only upon the conclusion of which could modern Europe with its new divisions and its new fates be perceived clearly. The breach with authority began in the very first years of the 16th century. It is not until the middle of the 17th century, at least, and even somewhat later, that the new era begins. For more than 100 years, the conception of the struggle as an ecumenical struggle, as something affecting the whole body of Europe, continued. The general upheaval, the revolt which first shook the West in the early years of the 16th century, to take a particular year, the year 1517, concerned all our civilization, was everywhere debated, produced a universal reaction met by as universal a resistance for 3 generations of men. No young man who saw the first outbreak of the storm could imagine it, even in old age, as a disruption of Europe. No such man lived to see it more than halfway through. It was not until a corresponding date in the succeeding century, or rather later, not until Elizabeth of England and Henry IV of France were dead, and all the protagonists, the reformers on one side, Loyola, Neri on the other, long dead, not until the career of Richelieu in the one country and the beginning of an aristocratic parliament in England were apparent, that the Reformation could clearly be seen to have separated certain districts of our civilization from the general traditions of the whole, and to have produced in special regions and sections of society the peculiar Protestant type which was to mark the future. The work of the Reformation was accomplished, one may say, a little after the outbreak of the 30 Years' War. England, in particular, was definitely Protestant by the decade 1620-1630, hardly earlier. The French Huguenot body, though still confused with political effort, had come to have a separate and real existence at about the same time. The oligarchy of Dutch merchants had similarly cut off their part of the Low Countries from imperial rule and virtually established their independence. The North German principalities and sundry smaller states of the mountains, notably Geneva, had definitely received the new stamp. As definitely, France, Bohemia, the Danube, Poland and Italy, and all the south were saved. Though an armed struggle was long to continue, though the northern Germans were nearly recaptured by the imperial power and only saved by French policy, though we were to have a reflex of it here in the civil wars and the destruction of the crown, and though the last struggle against the Stuarts and the greater general war against Louis XIV were but sequels to the vast affair, yet the great consequence of that affair was fixed before these wars began. The first third of the 17th century launches a new epoch. From about that time there go forward upon parallel lines the great spiritual and consequent temporal processes of modern Europe. They have yet to come to judgment, for they are not yet fulfilled, but perhaps their judgment is near. These processes, filling the last 300 years, have been as follows. 1. A rapid extension of physical science, and with it of every other form of acquaintance with demonstrable and measurable things. 2. The rise, chiefly in the new Protestant part of Europe, but spreading thence in part to the Catholic, of what we call today capitalism, that is, the possession of the means of production by the few and their exploitation of the many. 3. The corruption of the principle of authority until it was confused with mere force. 4. The general, though not universal, growth of total wealth with the growth of physical knowledge. 5. The ever-widening effect of skepticism which, whether masked under traditional forms or no, was from the beginning a spirit of complete negation and led at last to the questioning not only of any human institutions, but of the very forms of thought and of the mathematical truths. 6. With all these, of course, we have a universal mark, the progressive extension of despair. Could anyone look back upon these 3 centuries from some very great distance of time, he would see them as an episode of extraordinary extension in things that should be disassociated. Knowledge and wealth on the one hand, the unhappiness of men upon the other, and he would see that, as the process matured, or rather as the corruption deepened, all its marks were pushed to a degree so extreme as to jeopardize at last the very structure of European society. Physical science acquired such power, the oppression of the poor was pushed to such a length, the reasoning spirit in man was permitted to attain such a tottering pitch of insecurity, that a question never yet put to Europe arose at last, whether Europe, not from external foes, but from her own inward lesion, may not fail. Corresponding to that terrible and as yet unanswered question, the culmination of so much evil, necessarily arises this sole vital formula of our time: Europe must return to the faith, or she will perish. I have said that the prime product of the Reformation was the isolation of the soul. That truth contains in its development very much more than its mere statement might promise. The isolation of the soul means a loss of corporate sustenance, of the sane balance produced by general experience, the weight of security, and the general will. The isolation of the soul is the very definition of its unhappiness. But this solvent applied to society does very much more than merely complete and confirm human misery. In the first place, and underlying all, the isolation of the soul releases in a society a furious new accession of force. The break-up of any stable system in physics, as in society, makes actual a prodigious reserve of potential energy. It transforms the power that was keeping things together with the power driving separately each component part, the effect of an explosion. That is why the Reformation launched the whole series of material advance, but launched it chaotically and on divergent lines, which would only end in disaster. But the thing had many other results. Thus we next notice that the new isolation of the soul compelled the isolated soul to strong vagaries. The soul will not remain in the void. If you blind it, it will grope. If it cannot grasp what it appreciates by every sense, it will grasp what it appreciates by only one. On this account, in the dissolution of the corporate sense and of the corporate religion, you had successive idols set up, worthy and unworthy, none of them permanent. The highest and most permanent was the reaction towards corporate life in the shape of a worship of national patriotism. You had at one end of the scale an extraordinary new tabus, the erection in one place of a sort of maniac god, bloodthirsty, an object of terror; in another, or in the same, a curious new ritual observance of nothingness upon every seventh day; in another, an irrational attachment to particular printed book; in another, successive conceptions: first, that the human reason was sufficient for the whole foundations of human life, that there were no mysteries; next, the opposite extravagance, that the human reason had no authority even in its own sphere. And these two, though contradictory, had one root: the rationalism of the 18th century carried on through the materialism of the 19th, the irrational doubts of Kant, which include much emotional rubbish, carried on to the sheer chaos of the latter metaphysicians with their denial of contradictions and even of being. Both sprang from this necessity of the unsupported soul to make itself some system from within, as the unsupported soul, in an evil dream, now stifles in strict confinement and is next dissolved in some fearful emptiness. All this, the first interior effect of the Reformation, strong in proportion to the strength of the reforming movement, powerful in the regions or sects which had broken away, far less powerful in those which had maintained the faith, would seem to have run its full course, and to have settled at last into universal negation and a universal challenge preferred to every institution and every postulate. But since humanity cannot repose in such a stage of anarchy, we may well believe that there is coming, or has already begun, yet another stage in which the lack of corporate support for the soul will breed attempted strange religions, witchcrafts, and necromancies. It may be so. It may be that the great debate will come up for final settlement before such novel diseases spread far. At any rate, for the moment we are clearly in a stage of complete negation. But it is to be repeated that this breaking up of the foundations differs in degree with varying societies, that still, in a great mass of Europe, numerically the half perhaps, the necessary anchors of sanity still hold, and that half is the half where directly by the practice of the faith, or indirectly through a hold upon some part of its tradition, the Catholic Church exercises an admitted or distant authority over the minds of men. The end of section 37. Section 38, Europe and the Faith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc. Section 38, Chapter 10, concluded. The next process we note is by what some may think a paradox, also due to the isolation of the soul. It is the process of increasing knowledge. Men acting in a fashion highly corporate will not so readily question, nor therefore so readily examine, as will men acting alone. Men whose major results are taken upon an accepted philosophy will not be driven by such a need of inquiry as those who have abandoned that guide. In the moment, more than 1,000 years ago, when the last of the evangelizing flood tide was still running strongly, a very great man wrote of the physical sciences. Upon such toys I wasted my youth. And another wrote, speaking of divine knowledge, all the rest is smoke. But in the absences of faith, demonstrable things are the sole consolation. There are three forms in which the human mind can hold the truth. The form of science, which means that we accept a thing through demonstration and therefore cannot admit the possibility of its opposite. The form of opinion, which means that we accept a thing through probability, that is, through a partial but not complete demonstration, and therefore we do not deny the possibility of the opposite. The form of faith, where we accept a thing without demonstration and yet deny the possibility of its opposite, as for instance the faith of all men, not mad, in the existence of the universe about them and of other human minds. When acknowledged and defined, faith departs. It is clear that of the remaining two rivals, opinion has no ground against science. That which can be demonstrated holds all the field. Indeed, it is the mark of modern insufficiency that it can conceive of no other form of certitude save certitude through demonstration, and therefore does not as a rule appreciate even its own unproved first principles. Well, this function of the isolated soul, inquiry and the necessity for demonstration, for individual conviction through measurement and physical fixed knowledge, has occupied, as all know, the three modern centuries. We all are equally familiar with its prodigious results. Not one of them has as yet added to human happiness. Not one but has been increasingly misused to the misery of man. There is in the tragedy something comic also, which is the perpetual puzzlement of these the very authors of discovery, to find that somehow or other discovery alone does not create joy, and that somehow or other a great knowledge can be used ill, as anything else can be used ill. Also in their bewilderment many turn to a yet further extension of physical science as promising in some illogical way relief. A progression in physical science and in the use of instruments is so natural to man, so long as civic order is preserved, that it would indeed have taken place not so rapidly but as surely had the unity of Europe been preserved. But the destruction of that unity totally accelerated the pace, and as totally threw the movement off its rails. The Renaissance, a noble and vividly European thing, was much older than the Reformation, which was its perversion and corruption. The doors upon modern knowledge had been opened before the soul which was to enter them had been cut off from its fellows. We owe the miscarriage of all our great endeavor in this field not to that spring of endeavor but to its deflection. It is a blasphemy to deny the value of advancing knowledge, and at once a cowardice and a folly to fear it for its supposed consequences. Its consequences are only evil through an evil use, that is, through an evil philosophy. In connection with this release of powerful inquiry through the isolation of the soul, you have an apparently contradictory and certainly supplementary effect: the setting up of unfounded external authority. It is a curious development, one very little recognized, but one which a fixed observance of the modern world will immediately reveal. And those who come to see it are invariably astonished at the magnitude of its action. Men, under the very influence of skepticism, have come to accept almost any printed matter, almost any repeated name, as an authority infallible and to be admitted without question. They have come to regard the denial of such authority as a sort of insanity, or rather they have, in most practical affairs, come to be divided into two groups: a small number of men who know the truth, say upon a political matter or some financial arrangement or some unsolved problem, and a vast majority which accept without question, and always incomplete, a usually quite false, statement of the things, because it has been repeated in the daily press and vulgarized in 100 books. This singular and fantastic result of the long divorce between the non-Catholic mind and reason has profound effect upon the modern world. Indeed, the great battle about to be engaged between chaos and order will turn largely upon this form of suggestion, this acceptation of an unfounded and irrational authority. Lastly, there is of the major consequences of the Reformation that phenomenon which we have come to call capitalism, and which many, recognizing its universal evil, wrongly regard as the prime obstacle to right settlement of human society and to the solution of our now intolerable modern strains. What is called capitalism arose directly in all its branches from the isolation of the soul. That isolation permitted an unrestricted competition. It gave to superior cunning, and even to superior talent, an unchecked career. It gave every license to greed, and on the other side, it broke down the corporate bonds whereby men maintained themselves in an economic stability. Through it there arose in England, first later throughout the more active Protestant nations, and later still in various degrees throughout the rest of Christendom, a system under which a few possessed the land and the machinery of production, and the many were gradually dispossessed. The many thus dispossessed could only exist upon doles meted out by the possessors. Nor was human life a care to these. The possessors also mastered the state and all its organs, hence the great national debts which accompanied the system, hence even the financial hold of distant and alien men upon subject provinces of economic effort. Hence the draining of wealth, not only from increasingly dissatisfied subjects overseas, but from the individual producers of foreign independent states. The true conception of property disappears under such an arrangement, and you naturally get a demand for relief through the denial of the principle of ownership altogether. Here again, as in the matter of the irrational taboos and of skepticism, two apparently contradictory things have one root: capitalism and the ideal inhuman system, not realizable, called socialism. Both spring from one type of mind, and both apply to one kind of diseased society. Against both, the pillar of reaction is peasant society, and peasant society has proved throughout Europe largely coordinate with the remaining authority of the Catholic Church. For a peasant society does not mean a society composed of peasants, but one in which modern industrial capitalism yields to agriculture, and in which agriculture is in the main conducted by men possessed in part or altogether of their instruments of production and of the soil, either through ownership or customary tenure. In such a society all the institutions of the state repose upon an underlying conception of secure and well-divided private property, which can never be questioned and which colors all men's minds. And that doctrine, like every other sane doctrine, though applicable only to temporal conditions, has the firm support of the Catholic Church. So things have gone. We have reached at last, as the final result of that catastrophe 300 years ago, a state of society which cannot endure, and a dissolution of standards, a melting of the spiritual framework, such that the body politic fails. Men everywhere feel that an attempt to continue down this endless and ever-darkening road is like the piling up of debt. We go further and further from a settlement. Our various forms of knowledge diverge more and more. Authority, the very principle of life, loses its meaning, and this awful edifice of civilization which we have inherited and which is still our trust, trembles and threatens to crash down. It is clearly insecure. It may fall at any moment. We who still live may see the ruin. But ruin, when it comes, is not only a sudden, it is also a final thing. In such a crux there remains the historical truth that this, our European structure, built upon the noble foundations of classical antiquity, was formed through, exists by, is consonant to, and will stand only in the mold of the Catholic Church. Europe will return to the faith, or she will perish. The faith is Europe, and Europe is the faith. The end of section 38. The end of chapter 10. The end of Europe and the Faith by Hilaire Belloc.